I want to begin by acknowledging the land where I live, where I love, where I work, and where I learn, now known as St. John's, as the traditional territories of the Beothuk, and recognizing Kitakamcook, what is now called the island of Newfoundland, as the traditional and unceded territories of the Mi'kmaq and the Beothuk. I also want to recognize the Inuit of Nunatsiavut and Nunatuavut, and the Innu of Nitassinan and their ancestors as the original peoples of Labrador. For those who are not used to hearing land acknowledgement, a land acknowledgement is Indigenous protocol that allows me to honor and express gratitude to those who have long been and continue to be stewards of this place, and also to recognize and honor Indigenous ways of knowing and being that shape relationships with and to the land that I currently call home, and to acknowledge that I am a settler on unceded territories. I also wanted to thank me for the invitation to come to this conference. I want to thank all of you for sharing this space with me and for the conversations we've already had, for the papers that have already been presented, and those which will happen tomorrow, and the conversations that hopefully we'll continue to have after the conference ends. And I also want to thank my ancestors, without whom none of this would have been possible or even thought through. So I wanted to talk today about mud as a physical substance, but also as a methodological opening for working with, through, and against colonial archives. And let me tell you, whenever I tell people that I'm working on mud, they look at me like I'm from Mars. So if you feel that way, that's totally fine. But along the way, I also want to think about questions of sedimentation. I am a child of a geologist and the sister of a physical geographer, but also of unsettling. And I want to offer some examples of how I see scholars, creative folks, and scholar creatives playing with mud. If I'd been on hold, that works good. So thinking with and through geography has, for me, offered really rich ways of engaging not just with colonial archives, but also with the afterlives of colonial histories. Much of this thinking comes from a major research project that resulted in, among others, my 2019 book, What the Oceans Remember, Searching for Belonging and Home, which is an autoethnography in the form of a critical memoir that considers questions of history, race, place, identity, and belonging through the lens of my own complicated family history, which spans 5 continents, but which comes together in Suriname, a former Dutch colony on the north coast of South America. And here on this slide, you see pictures of my grandmother and my grandfather and my great-grandmother. This is my Surinamese Hindustani, what's still called in Suriname, Hindustani grandmother, whose father and grandmother arrived in Suriname in 1874 as indentured laborers from India. My Afro-Surinamese Creole grandfather and his mother, and his mother's mother, so his grandmother, was enslaved, with a history that is lost in the Middle Passage, certainly before her ancestors arrived some point in the late 18th century in Suriname. So in this presentation, I draw on 2 books that are really a pair. They don't look like they'd be a pair given the titles, but the one on the right, Autoethnography and Feminist Theory at the Water's Edge, which I wrote with 2 graduate students, is a book of microessays that takes up feminist geographies, feminist posthumanism, feminist theory, to think through some of the stuff that underpins What the Oceans Remember, but is not necessarily overtly evident in the text of my memoir. So when I started the research that became What the Oceans Remember, at the level of theory, given my interest in oceanic, global ocean-based migrations, I was interested in thinking through what the ocean, or the water-based, might have to offer. And here I started thinking with work of scholars such as Christina Sharp in the Wake, who uses the idea of the wake to work through the afterlives of slavery. Renissa Mawani, in Across Oceans of Law, develops what she calls an oceanic methodology, where she considers the layering of conflicting currents, oceanic currents, to develop ideas of nation, nationalism, and empire in the relation to the case of the Komagata Maru, which was a ship filled with would-be immigrants from what was then British India seeking to immigrate to Canada in 1914, most of whom were denied. And that particular ship represents a profound challenge to racist immigration understandings of the period. Elspeth Probyn, in Eating the Ocean, considers the ocean as a horizon, as a site of encounter between human and more than human, and as an entangled borderland. And Karen Amamoto Ingersoll, who introduces what she calls a seascape methodology, in her words, an approach to knowing through a visual, spiritual, intellectual, and embodied literacy of land and sea, the colors of the clouds, the flows of the currents, fish and seaweed, the timing of ocean swells, depths, tides, and celestial bodies, all circulating and flowing with rhythms and pulsations. And then not shown here, Astrida Neymanis's theorization of water bodies that seeks to consider imbrication of human bodies into the more than human world. But I also had a really much longer standing interest in land-based geographies of the in-between. So some classic works Gloria Anzaldúa's Borderlands, La Frontera, which is situated at the contested US-Mexico border and develops the idea of borderlands consciousness, located between languages, geographies, and identities. The quote there, soy un amacimiento, I'm an act of kneading, of uniting and joining that not only has produced both a creature of darkness and a creature of light, but also a creature that questions the definitions of light and dark and gives them new meanings. And also Hélène Cixous, who tangles with what she calls the entre-deux, an indefinable space where meaning collapses, and in the way that she articulates questions of nation identity and place in relation to contested political histories of Algeria, France, Hungary, and the Czech Republic. How could I be from a France that colonized an Algerian country when I knew that we ourselves, German, Czechoslovak, Hungarian Jews, were other Arabs? But as I started digging more deeply, I realized that neither of these framings, either water or land-based, as seductive as they were, and for someone who loves feminist theory, I was seduced fully, none of them were adequate to what I was interested in, because they're important groundings or floatings or however you want to imagine the water-based, but they didn't go far enough, because what I was interested in was encounter, the point where water meets land. So what I needed to do was think about mud. This is what remains, one of the few remains of Bent's Hope Plantation in Suriname, owned by the Englishman John Bent. So I wanted to think about mud in many, I think mud operates in various registers in various ways. So here's a surveyor's map of Suriname in the 19th century. And I think I want to demonstrate here, look at how mud operates in terms of geography as that messy space between water and land, an interstitial space that is notoriously difficult to define. And so I've added the numbers here to go through it. The geography of the coastline is a geography of mud, and many plantations, even before abolition in 1863, many plantations had already eroded completely and disappeared. If you look at this, the mouth of the bottom of the image is the Caribbean Sea, and then you see the river going up, the one that goes straight back, well, straight, windy back to the top, is the Suriname River. That to its right, you will encounter the capital city of Paramaribo. The other river that going to the left is the Gomaveina River that reads into what were the earliest plantation regions when plantation slavery was instituted, and the process was instituted. And if you look at the map, all of those numbers correspond to different kinds of mud. So number 1, Modderbank, mud banks of Suriname. Number 2, Modder met zand, mud with sand. Number 3, Zandbakken, and 2 different kinds of sandbanks in number 3. Number 4 is the mangrove land. So with the idea that this could be quote unquote the official edge of the land with mangrove roots holding the land in at that point. Number 5 is still called land, but it's called clay-like land. And all of these can be understood within the rubric of mud. And all of that exists in the space between water, the ocean, the river, and land in the colonial city and the plantations. And actually, if you go, for anybody who happens to read Dutch, and there may be somebody, if you look at the very top, you'll see swamp-like land as well. So it's still very muddy and uncertain in that space. Beyond geography, mud can also help us understand that messy space where peoples meet through violence, through chance, opportunity, desire, control, loss, love, sometimes a really messy combination of all of the above. Encounters happen in this sticky space because mud is a contact zone where indigenous people encountered colonial authorities, where enslaved Africans encountered indigenous people, where indentured laborers first set foot on land after 3 months of journeying. And this is a very typical postcard that you can find in Suriname of the different kinds of peoples who have made their home in Suriname for a variety of reasons. And taking this further, mud is also the contact zone that exists in the afterlives of encounter, in the mixed peoples that result from sexual contact with or without consent. The intermixing of peoples in Suriname has resulted in a very muddy racial and ethnic identities, and as a result of forced and voluntary and sometimes in between oceanic migrations, Suriname is one of the most multicultural countries in the world, and much of that multiculturalism is carried within single bodies. What are the afterlives of contact? How are individuals positioned by others? How do they position themselves? What kinds of allegiances are possible? What kinds of allegiances are impossible? And I'm thinking here of some of the work of Anne-Laura Stoller as well. Mud might also help us wrangle with the messy space of the colonial archive itself, where colonized folks jostle both against and within the directives of colonial authorities. So here we have, this is the slave register, the case of Jan Houthakker. Jan Houthakker was enslaved and then was freed. And then he made it his goal to free as many enslaved folks as possible. But in order to do this, he had to work within the system that required him to purchase and, quote, own other enslaved individuals before he could free them. So on this particular page, you see all the names on the left-hand side of the people that he purchased, who are then crossed out because they were then freed. On the right-hand side of the page, the first column on the right-hand side lists the names of who he purchased them from. The second column, the column just to the left, the second column from the left, the second column on the right-hand side of the page, the column with all the words here, there. That's what I'll say. That gives that gives the date they were manumitted and the names under which they were manumitted. And finally, MUD may help us work through that messy space where researchers meet the archives. And this is a window into the Maritime History Archive at my university, which houses 75% of the crew agreements and captain's logs of British registered ships from 1860s to 1938. It's a super important source of thinking through colonial ocean-based migrations. So MUD asks us how to think about how we as researchers move across intellectual spaces. So for example, in the case of my work, there's a lot of work that looks at histories of slavery and histories of indenture, but very little that says what happens when these two meet, because of course they do meet. Very little work considers how they intersected with one another, considers the nature of muddy encounters among peoples, and where relationships are not clear-cut or easily definable, as much as colonial authorities sought constantly to define and redefine the borders between groups. MUD as Encounter 2 asks us to think reflexively about who we are as researchers, and this has come up a couple of times today, what histories we bring to the archives ourselves, and how these personal histories shape the lenses that we use to approach the materials that we find there. And finally, MUD may offer ways of dealing with archival silence and archival violence. What do we do when archival silences yawn louder than the materials that remain? What do we do when we don't want to replicate the violence that we find in the archive? And this as well has come up in both of these have come up in today's presentations. What might happen if we embrace muddy ways of knowing, rather than always searching for transparency, clarity, or revelation? So archival research underpins what the oceans remember, but it was materials I had to work with were partial and fragmentary at best. And the stories of my enslaved and indentured ancestors emerged only in colonial accountings: name, age, height, mother, religion, skin color, bodily markings, plantation name. And read as a unit, these records contribute to a dismembering and indeed a dehumanizing of the colonized body. And so to get a sense and to really work with this notion of dismemberment, I started creating a found poem while working with the ship's logs of the Kate Kellogg, the ship on which my ancestors journeyed from India to Suriname. And one thing that stood out to me, as I mentioned, was the way colonial authorities sought to distinguish brown bodies from one another by delineating skin color and also by identifying bodily markings, scars, etc. And bearing in mind that this was also a period when fingerprinting really took off as a way of distinguishing colonized brown Indian bodies. So as part of my methodology, I wanted to get both into the mindset of colonial authorities and to consider if there were any possibilities at all for resistance, or at least some kind of refusal. And so I recorded all the languages for skin color and bodily markings of the first 100 records, and then I rearranged them from light brown, at the very top, I'll move the English now here, from light brown and to dark to almost black to black, to try and see as colonial authorities had seen. And then in between, I slotted in the bodily markings. And so you can see the move there. I was trying to figure out, okay, how did they understand? Because the record from my great-great-grandmother says dark brown. What the heck does dark brown mean? How do I even unpack that today? And one way to try and work with that was to take it apart and reconstruct it in a very different sort of way. And so I'm also asking, if the colonial archive dismembers the colonized, is it possible to remember the past differently? And for me, one possible way of remembering was to sink myself up to the eyeballs in mud, really, to try and see what happened in that space of mud. So I wanted to think about mud. So according to the Oxford English Dictionary, mud is a, quote, soft, glutinous material made of a combination of things, unquote. Geologically, its consistency is never completely solid, nor completely liquid. Rather, it's something that brings the fluid and the solid together into a new form that blends both. More figurative definitions understand mud as something confusing, frustrating, perplexing. And these definitions move me into the realm of Mary Douglas, Julia Kristeva. Mud defies order. It confounds. There's confusion, disorder, and mess. It's a threat and a site of danger. And yet it's within the dregs, within these sort of worthless bits, within this confusion, within this disorder and mess, that you need to dig in order to find stories. Because slinging mud, as we all know, brings mud out of the natural world and into the realm of social relations. It's about scandal and social exclusion. It's what sticks to you, but you can't get off. A slimy or sticky substance, mud might be understood through the work of Sarah Ahmed as clingy or sticky. Its mud is something you need to wash away, but it always leaves hints of itself behind. There's a troubling opacity to mud, and also an uncomfortable fleshiness. Mud stories are stories you don't want to tell, but which will be told for you. They're things you don't want to touch, but refuse to let you go. Back to Bent's Home Plantation. Mud may not be, at a fundamental level, mud is about encounter. It's not necessarily interesting in and of itself. It's interesting to the extent that it interacts with other things, both human and non-human. And what you see here is the rainforest basically reclaiming the plantation, the structures that were still existed at the plantation. What sticks, Ahmed writes, shows us where the object has traveled through what it has gathered onto its surface, gatherings that become part of the object and call into question its integrity as an object. What did colonial authority encounters look like, sound like, feel like, smell like, taste like? How is power navigated? What forms might resistance have taken? How might we sift through the archival mud? What do our encounters look like today? What stories might we find? And once we find them, what can we do with them? The work of Wolastoq tenor, musicologist, and activist Jeremy Dutcher offers one evocative form of encounter. Dutcher is a member of the Tobique First Nation in what is now New Brunswick, and he was trained in the Western classical music tradition and for many years had little access to his language, which has been suppressed by the Canadian state through the Indian residential school system. As part of a research project of the Canadian Museum of History, which used to be called the Canadian Museum of Civilization, and that's yet another big discussion we could possibly have, he heard and transcribed ethnographic wax cylinder recordings from 1907 of traditional Wolastoq songs, and from there engaged in a process of, quote, collaboration, where he sang and composed through and with the language and voices of his ancestors as captured in wax cylinder recordings made by colonial ethnomusicologists. And as he states, I'm doing this work because there's only about 100 Wolastoqi speakers left. It's crucial for us to make sure that we're using our language and passing it on to the next generation. If you lose the language, you're not just losing words, you're losing an entire way of seeing and experiencing the world from a distinctly Indigenous perspective. Meaning in this haunting work comes from the muddiness of the counter between past and present, the stickiness of a colonial archive that sought to erase Indigenous culture and language while also capturing it on wax cylinders, and the messiness of using Western classical music traditions to interrogate and challenge that stickiness while also simultaneously recovering and honoring Indigenous language and culture. And from there, the vibrant and resistant possibility of using the colonial archive to move towards what Cree scholar and poet Billy Ray Belcourt has termed Indian joy. What this suggests is that the muddy encounter between past and present is that mud is always and already haunted, but ghosts, as Avery Gordon reminds us, are, quote, never innocent. Like mud, they make trouble and they don't follow rules. Ghosts linger, marking the past in present tense. And they stick, sucking us inexorably into the glutinous, complicated, uncomfortable webs of rememberings. As Christina Sharp observes in The Wake, we are made and unmade by the stickiness of our encounters, the life and death work of our past inevitably haunting our presence. Playing with mud, so too do we become mud, our beings also shaped by the ghosts and hauntings embedded within the muck we are navigating. I am the very mudscape upon which I cast my gaze. What stories can mud tell? What worlds are unmade through mud? And by contrast, what worlds might be made and unmade in the mud? So I want to move to an example that probably is better known by some of you. In her work, Zong, Canadian poet, essayist, and lawyer Emner Basie Phillip reimagines the 1783 Gregson versus Gilbert court case which was fought over insurance monies in the aftermath of a massacre that saw between 132 and 150 enslaved Africans thrown overboard from the English ship, the Zong. That ship used to be the Dutch ship, the Zorg, which means care, ironically. Philip's work is constructed entirely from the 1.5-page extant summary of the court case as a series of what she calls zongs that delve into the dark, murky muck of this case and the transatlantic slave trade more broadly speaking. The zongs spill across pages of the text, and in these poems, as you can see, space crowds out letters, sometimes remapping language and thought in a performance of refusal. A refusal to trade in tragedy, but also a refusal of the work of logic and linearity. Instead, these are, in Philip's words, quote-unquote, not-tellings, half-tellings, and untellings that nevertheless must be told. Central to Philip's work is a refusal of colonial logic. Instead, by, in her words, mutilating the archive, she points to the fundamental illogic and nonsense of colonial thought. As she writes in the notanda that follows, the essay that follows the poems, the not-telling of this particular story is in the fragmentation and mutilation of the text, forcing the eye to track across the page in an attempt to wrest meaning from words gone astray. The resulting abbreviated, disjunctive, and almost nonsensical style of the poems demands a corresponding effort on the part of the reader to make sense of an event that eludes understanding, perhaps permanently. In the discomfort and disturbance created by the poetic text, I am forced to make meaning from apparently disparate elements, and in so doing, I implicate myself. The risk of contamination lies in piecing together the story that cannot be told, and since we have to work to complete the events, we all become implicated in, if not contaminated by, this activity. In Zong, Philip unmakes language. Words are fragmented, reduced to sounds and cries, and language as we know it is impossible. Drifting between the sounds and cries, readers must confront the illogic of colonial logic, and in that process, they're implicated in that colonial logic. But Philip takes the metrics of colonial logics further. While the, quote, archival mathematics, and that's Catherine McKittrick's term, of the court records account for the enslaved only in numbers, Philip names them, arranging their letters into names into a manifest of footnotes that runs across the bottom of every page of the first section of Zong. And you can see them here, the names that are running across the bottom. These names are a recitation, or an incantation, an intimate scroll of the dead, each one called into being through and with the fragmentation of the text. They're an archival undoing that simultaneously challenges and brings into high relief the foundational violence of colonial and imperial endeavors. Philip's work can be understood as a sort of counter-archive that troubles the foundation by revealing its illogic, and the counter-archive is founded on the violence that underpins the original text itself. And if you look at the verbs that she uses here, I mutilate the text as the fabric of African life and the lives of these men, women, and children were mutilated. I murder the text, literally cut it into pieces, castrating verbs, suffocating adjectives, murdering nouns, throwing articles, prepositions, conjunctions overboard, jettisoning adverbs. The story of the Zong, Philip's archival mutilations assert, should never have been realized. It cannot be realized. It must remain opaque and muddy, because it's an impossible story that can never be told, because it makes no sense. As such, it remains suspended, unsettled, unfinished, and incomplete in its horror. Mud here is the sticky and uncomfortable encounter that forces us to realize, as Philip has asserted, that we are implicated in these ugly histories. But even as it can't be told, she writes, it must be told. While we may, as researchers and thinkers trying to work with materials like the summary of the court case, may be tempted to bring them together into a coherent and seemingly logical conclusion that ties up loose ends, Philip's work suggests that it might be more ethical to dwell in the noise, in the mess, and in the struggle. Philip's choice of verbs is telling. The violence enacted on enslaved Africans is here enacted on the colonial text, rendering what appears transparent to British court illegible, murky, slimy, sticky. Philip's work, which might be read as an active engagement with muddiness through a refusal of logic of colonial archive, has challenged me to think through my own vested interest in coherence and my seeming need to tie up loose ends and to make sure everything fits neatly, and my desire to somehow put all the puzzle pieces into place. But I wonder what other possible iterations of my work might still exist. What if I had taken the archive completely apart, as Philip did? If I had mutilated it, hacked at it, resisted it, refused it? What else might have emerged in the space of writing and thinking then? So this is a page from the record for the British ship the Medea, which brought indentured laborers from Calcutta to Paramaribo in 1874. And I wanted to look at this in relation to questions of the viscous and mud, thinking of mud as a form of viscosity too. The viscous, writes Elizabeth Grosh, quote, lacks self-containment. It's, quote, a formlessness that engulfs all form, a disorder that threatens all order. And mud here threatens boundaries and makes trouble. Imagined as a borderland, it might be understood as a, quote, vague and undetermined space, a constant state of transition. And it's not the boundary breaking that threatens, but the fact that mud in its basic composition resists the notion of boundaries. This resistance to form is visceral and embodied and provokes embodied responses. So here we have this page, and I'm going to zoom into that page. So this journey was to Suriname. What is interesting here are the inconsistencies in the archival record, with a few laborers changing age between their initial recording on the document and their arrival in Suriname a few months later. And on the surface, such discrepancies are probably not necessarily surprising. It's not uncommon to find that numbers have been incorrectly transcribed and need adjustment, but these adjustments are not minor. Sometimes the age difference is a matter of a decade or two. So Gulam Daibi is originally listed as being 28 years old, and by the time he arrives in Suriname, he's 45. Durjan Gungu was also originally 28, and by the time he arrived, he was 38. More striking still on another page is a person named Rampersad. Originally he's labeled as 36, and his revised age is 60. To me, these read as examples of the muddiness, not just of the archive, but of sedimented colonial logic that seeks clarity and transparency, but is continually thwarted by much more complicated realities of colonial encounters. It could potentially also be an instance of resistance, where the space between the two recorded ages becomes a moment of possibility, a form of unsettling that might allow alternative stories to emerge. Moving beyond Ahmed's notion of stickiness as encounter, we might also consider mud itself as lacking integrity. Already a product of stickiness, mud itself is continually resurfacing. Sediment and water continuously interact with one another, constantly churning and moving together to create that thing we call mud. To follow on the work of political theorist Jane Bennett, mud is vibrant matter, a substance that drags its histories along with itself, carries within it not only the sands that mark its journeys, but also human sediments, the storied bones, and the detritus of lives lived and lost. What happens when these sedimented histories erode and break apart, when the solidity of land gives way to mud, when histories mingle, when the clarity sought after is impossible? One evocative example of this work is the work of erosion. In Suriname, as I mentioned previously, many plantations located right at the shoreline have eroded. Some eroded before 1850, and the shoreline continues to erode today. And sometimes that process of erosion, of water and land interacting, of the unsettling of land, makes for grisly discoveries. Recent erosion revealed bones and the remains of a slave burial ground. And in this way, mud, as a process of unsettling, can be revelatory. But mud can also and equally obscure, and in this way remind us that some stories cannot, and perhaps should not, be told. In the work of Eve Tuck and Kei Wayne Yang, tissue samples, blood draws, and cheek swabs are not only our own, the DNA contained in them is shared by our relatives, our ancestors, our future generations, and this is equally true of stories. Mud is not a single substance, but a conglomeration, a constellation, an assemblage of substances. And in its constant movement, it articulates unstable, shifting geographies, gathering histories into itself, even as sediment swirls through water, resurfacing itself with every new layer of sedimentation. If we are all watery, as Astrida Neymanis has said, then we're also all muddy, our sticky surfaces and glutinous clingings inhering in our beings. But if conventional definitions of mud locate it as a site of filth and disorder, of trouble, pollution, then what of the corporeal pleasures of mud? What of that feeling of toes squelching and squirching in cool mud on a hot summer's day, or the damp, moist earth that gardeners work between their fingers every spring? What of the pleasures of formlessness, that intimate stickiness that we embrace, long for, desire? Can we think of mud as an invocation a provocation to intimacy, as a form of resistance, a site of imagination, inspiration? Can we play with mud differently? If mud has a foundational quality of opacity, rendering things darker and inaccessible, it's also tactile and malleable. It's a formlessness that can be reshaped any number of ways. And so might we consider mud as a site of possibility and transformation. Mud is not shameful, dark, or disgusting. Rather, it is Siksu's wound, generative, productive, gestational. And here I want to think of creative critical work occasioned by colonial archives, works of creative and critical resistance, where mud play is about telling alternative stories, where colonized subjects refuse their archival containment, gleefully breaking free into new realities. So I wanted to start with Saidiya Hartman, who has also been mentioned earlier today. In her most recent book, Wayward Lives, Beautiful Experiments, which if you haven't read it, you really should, is an exploration of young women's lives in Philadelphia and New York as they imagined, engaged, and lived with the idea of freedom. And she looks for stories that reside underneath and around the archival record in order to, quote, experience and understand the world as these young women did, and to learn from what they know. Hartman suggests that the text that results is a, quote, fugitive text, one that's constantly escaping the boundaries that have been created for it. And as she writes, I prefer to think of this book as the fugitive text of the wayward, and it's marked by the errantry that it describes. And in this spirit, I've pressed at the limits of the case file and the document, speculated about what might have been, imagined the things whispered in dark bedrooms, and amplified moments of withholding, escape, and possibility, moments when the vision and dreams of the wayward seemed possible. In this case, Hartman pushes into the muddy definitions of waywardness to imagine alternative possibilities for Black women's understandings of freedom. We might also consider Australian Narungga poet-scholar Natalie Harkin's Archival Poetics, a collection of 3 slim volumes, Colonial Archive, Haunting, and Blood Memory, that interrogates, challenges, and undoes the colonial archive not just in textual form, with poems and fragments, but also in the form of physical baskets that she crafted from handwritten letters written by her grandmother and great-grandmother to the Aborigines Protection Board and the Children's Welfare Board. She had them copied onto banana leaf paper, and then she formed them into baskets. As she writes the process behind both baskets and poems, weaving became a central conceptual metaphor and literal cultural practice in my research and archival poetic praxis. To liberate these letters in ways previously unimagined, to free them from the state and weave them back into the world, into my family and into my body, and to transform forwards through an archive fever labor of love. It became an intuitive means to gather, hold, and liberate my Nana and great-grandmother's words from the archive box, to reckon with history and honor a very different story to what is officially documented on the record about them. Mud is intersected with multiple meanings. It's indeed infested and polluted, a space of horror and disgust. It's also imaginative and tactile and redemptive. And within itself, mud is continually revising and reinventing itself, shoring itself up even as it erodes. Playing with mud is an act of creation, the making of mud with and through others. In its constant resurfacing, its continual reimagining, reinventing, and reshaping, it is both sedimentation and fragmentation. And in this way, it is not just about past and present, but also about haunted futures. Here we might think of the work of scholar creatives like Camille Turner, whose Afronautic Research Lab invites participants to read, engage, and reckon with histories of slavery in Canada with the help of Afronauts, interlocutors from the future. In Turner's words, both history and the future are places to stand to give us more perspective. The future is an important perspective because it lifts you out of what's happening now, so that you can imagine what you want to have happen. The Afronauts, quote, unbury and unsilence histories by showcasing books, copies of advertisements for escaped slaves, maps, paintings, drawings, and more, all of which must be read in the dark using magnifying glasses and flashlights. The images, these stills are taken from when she presented her work as part of the Bona Vista Biennale in Newfoundland, and it focused in particular on Newfoundland's embarkation in the transatlantic slave trade through the 19 slave ships built in Newfoundland and the salt cod sold to the Caribbean to feed enslaved people. And let me just tell you a small anecdote. When I got my job in Newfoundland, my aunt said, Newfoundland, where the bachao comes from. So where the saltfish comes from, that's how she knew Newfoundland. Although my uncle then said, no, it came from Halifax. But anyway, there you go. It came from Nova Scotia and not from Newfoundland. Anyway, but this is in her imagining, Newfoundland was salt cod for her. And she has never stepped foot in Newfoundland ever in her life. As Turner has said, art can do all kinds of things. It can lull you into submission. It can support the status quo. It can be a way of domesticating people, but it can also be an amazing tool to challenge the status quo, to ask questions, and provoke critical thinking, and that's how I prefer to use art. An evocation or invocation to mud, in its constant oozing, may allow us to consider mud as a metaphor for movement and migration. It's a space of and for transition. The surfacing and resurfacing intentionality of mud evokes the dense stickiness that results when peoples move around, encounter, meet, and struggle. Mud as a product of erosion, meanwhile, reminds us that geographies are always unstable. As an undoing, a gnawing away at an older order, mud reveals stories to us, and at the same time shows us that we can tell new stories. As vibrant matter at the water's edge, mud exists only through a layering of histories, the murky swirling of earth with water, and past with present with future. Always shifting and changing, it exists only in the plural. It can never be reduced to a single element. Both haunted and haunting, mud can function as a murky site of memory and remembering. In his 2017 book, The Art of Creative Research, Philip Gerard quotes the words of a poet named Emily Wilson, who discovered, in Gerard's words, that, quote, there are some things she will just never be able to find out. Interestingly, this doesn't shut down Wilson's work. Rather, in Wilson's own words, quote, my poetry manuscript in progress now has a trajectory, an arc of revealed information that creates a journey. The starting point of that journey was a state of unknowing, and I haven't reached the ending point because there isn't one. The progression of my manuscript will flow from unknowing to unknowing a little less. And this is okay. The research process taught me that unknowing is not an acceptable excuse for being inactive, but that active unknowing is also okay. In What the Oceans Remember, what Wilson calls active unknowing might instead be understood as a practice of muddiness. In the process of playing with mud, of digging in the dirt, unsettling sedimented histories, and considering the continual processes of resurfacing, I did indeed shed some light. It's dim, wavery, sometimes it flickers. From other angles, it's a surprise in a spotlight. And from others still, it remains murky, dark, and unknowable. And as a researcher and as a person, I have to accept that that's okay. In my mind's eye, I'm back in Suriname, standing at its muddy shores. I listen to the river. I watch mud and water and waves. I hear the motor of small taxi boats and the sounds of voices. I look at the prayer flags flapping in the breeze, telling other stories of waters and journeys and histories. At a sluice, I watch a girl fishing for crabs. Those crabs, or others very much like them, will be on full display at the weekend market, their claws fumbling weakly in the equatorial sun, mud caking and drying against their shells. In the distance, at the mouth where the Suriname and Comavena rivers meet, I watch the dolphins smiling as I see tourists on a boat playing Titanic at the stern, a peach-colored scarf rising up and over, fluttering in the breeze. The taxi boat rocks gently in the waves, a subtle spray washing on the deck. Above me, a collection of life jackets, orange against a blue roof, and behind me, the murmuring chatter of other passengers. Along the shores, land gives way to mud. Mud merges imperceptibly into water. I see the mangroves, their roots digging deep, and I wonder what they'll find. Thank you.